right.
Yay.
Good morning. Welcome to Compelling Visual Development. I'm Chandana Ekanayake, which is a long Sri Lankan name. Most people just call me Eka. You can call me that later.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Chelsea. And apparently I'm an interrupting presenter, co-host.
No, we're done. It's a conversation, right?
Chelsea, what's your last name?
Oh, Douglas.
Much easier than mine.
Yeah.
So a little bit about myself. I'm the art director at Uber Entertainment. We're a studio in Kirkland. Staff about 23. We started in 2008. Our first game we released was called Monday Night. Oh, there you go. Monday Night Combat. Came out in Summer Arcade 2010 on XBLA, and then in 2011 we released it on Steam. And then early last year, we did a follow-up called Super MNC, which is a free-to-play version of Monday Night Combat. Monday Night Combat is it's a third-person shooter, strategic shooter, a little bit of Dota elements in a tongue-in-cheek, futuristic sport world with guns. Yeah.
And bacon.
And bacon, yeah. And then, lots of bacon, yeah. And then in August of last year, we launched a Kickstarter called Planetary Annihilation, which got funded in September to a tune of $2.2 million, so we're really happy about that. We had about 44,000. Any backers here?
Yep.
There you go. Oh, awesome. Good to hear. Yeah. We had about 44,000 backers. It's for those of you who haven't heard about it, it's an RTS. It's an old school RTS. It was a game called Total Annihilation in the 90s that some of our guys at Uber worked on, so we wanted to bring that back. And it's like, well, let's try Kickstarter. Maybe people will actually like it, and they did. So today, actually, this week, we've been releasing the alpha. Right now, the alpha's going out while I'm doing this talk. Awesome. And so Planetary Annihilation was built on a brand new engine. Before that, we worked on Unreal. So we decided to do a new engine for the game. And while the engine was being built for PA, I decided to work on a smaller title. So we wanted to make sure the engine was compatible for PC, Mac, Linux, iOS. So a game called Outland Games is what myself and a couple other guys worked on. And this is a screen from that. We'll talk more about that a little later. And then more recently, I've been working on an iOS game. This is some of my work from that. It's called Toybots, just not announced yet. We don't have a real name for it. I hope to show it off at PAX Prime, so if you're there, you'll get to play it. That's for iPad, iPhone, and anything else we can get it on. And we're using Unity for that one.
All right, cool. Hi, my name's Chelsea. So I started off in visual effects doing concept art for commercials and music videos. And then later down the road, I actually got hired at Irrational Games, where I was a concept artist there working on BioShock Infinite. And I did some Liz stuff. And had lots of fun. And then I started hopping around doing freelance for all kinds of studios, which is how I met Eka. And moved up to Seattle, and I've been here for a while. And I recently just got picked up by a small indie studio called Trivial Technology, and I'm really excited to be back into a team environment and not just at my desk freelancing. So it's awesome and fun, and I love it, and I like unicorns. So
all the designs that she did for us, there was always a unicorn
or
a
rainbow
involved. Yeah.
Or sparkle.
Yeah. So the topic of our talk is why do we think some games look more interesting than others. Some of the things as we're doing research for this talk, we're looking at a bunch of games. We focused on games that have been released in the last year with a very small art team. So for any 1-man, 2-man, 3-man, whatever art teams, that are mainly for PC, console, mobile. So the things that we found across all these different games and styles were these elements. So first of all, the art reinforces the gameplay. So depending on the gameplay, whatever it is the art helping it out? And all the games we're going to talk about, they do a really good job of reinforcing the gameplay. Second, a good use of art fundamentals, which we'll cover a little later, what that means of color, contrast, hierarchy, rhythm, things like that are things that you typically learn in art school as an artist. And a lot of it, I went to art school for a very brief amount of time, and everything else has been self-taught, where for you learn a lot of this in art school.
No, I was self-taught.
There you go.
I learned 3D.
So don't go to art school.
Don't go to school.
A lot of the stuff the stuff we're covering are things that we found really interesting, and that have helped us along the way as we're making various games. The third thing I want to talk about is setting mood. Is the art supporting the mood? Is it a fun game like Angry Birds? Is the mood, is the art style showing off that mood, or is it a creepy game like Limbo? Is the art style supporting that? So make sure the art really supports the gameplay and the mood of it. And then the fourth thing is the polished core experience. What that means is, what is the player doing? Are they, if say it's a platformer, are they spending a lot of time moving around, jumping, hitting things? And are your visuals reinforcing that? If it's by animation or with particle effects or whatever, is the art supporting the thing the player does a lot, repetitively? The last thing we think some of these games work really well is immersion. From the first time you load the game up to the title screen to the intros to gameplay, the menus, in and out. Is it keeping the player engaged, and is it keeping them immersed? First screenshot we chose is a Rayman Jungle Run. I don't know if you guys have played that. It's on iOS. It has a very stylistic, illustrative style. It's a runner, and it's pretty fast-paced, and the colors and the character designs really showcase that. And this is Jack Lumber, which is a fantastic game. Again, in more of an illustrative style, and the art really reinforces the style of gameplay, which we'll cover a little later. And this is a game called Thomas Was Alone. It's a very minimal graphic design style where everything's blocks, but they do a really good job in the game of giving personalities to the different blocks. There's 4 or 5 different types of blocks. Each have their own personalities and different movement mechanics and colors to convey what kind of person they are, or what kind of character they are. This is Hundreds. Again, the artist who worked on this, Greg, comes from a very much a graphic design web background and Flash. So he's using a lot of circular shapes and minimal color palette, very minimal color palette, just a bunch of gray values and red for important things, and a slight vignetting. You see the little darkening around the edges to really showcase it. This is Guacamelee, fantastic game. It's on PSN and Vita. It's a 2D side-scroller platformer, action-adventure game, but their approach is to use 3D character art and 3D elements, but sort of framed to the camera, so they look 2D. The shapes are awesome. This is Kentucky Route Zero. It's a fantastic game, again, done with 3D elements, 3D characters, 3D environments, but using a camera that's very much a 2D side-scroller type game. Sword and Sorcery. So this is an example of a really well-done pixel art game. Limited palette, great use of rhythm, spacing, and which we'll cover a little more in detail. Another pixel art game, Hotline Miami. The whole game is like this drug-infused bender of some kind, so they do a really good job of conveying that. Just the whole trip, start to finish. From the title screen that echoes out of control to everything you do in the game. It's pretty crazy. And Earwalk combines lots of different techniques like 2D illustration style and 3D elements. The way this is built, which we'll get into a little later, is he's using 3D elements, textures mapped onto 3D elements. So even though all those games have all different styles, they all share a core set of fundamentals, which we call the game art toolbox.
Yeah, and that was something kind of interesting that I got to learn about as we were developing this talk. So the game art toolbox is essentially like these fundamentals for game development that we think that will actually behoove you and your teams to keep in mind through development. So the first one is failing fast and failing small, aka iteration. You're not going to get it on the first try, typically. If you do, awesome. Please tell me what you're doing, because I would love to have that. Don't be completely married to one thing. Make sure that you're light on your feet, you're nimble. Art is an iterative process. The creative process is not just one straight shot. It's pretty organic, especially when you're working in an interactive medium like games. Another tool you can use are the art fundamentals, really capitalizing on contrast, composition, making sure that your animation is dovetailing with your characters and your prop pieces to really sell the world that you've created. Visual narrative, making sure that you don't necessarily have to hit the player with like a wall of text to convey an action that's happening. Like show it to them. Like your icons don't necessarily have to have words on them. You can use iconography and imagery, and then polishing the core experience as well, as we talked about before. Just really refining, essentially the parts of the game that your player is going to be interacting with the most. And then keeping your mind open. Like I said, creative process is an organic one, and being able to be flexible and just kind of roll with the punches actually will really help you and make making games a lot less painful because it can be a process. Alrighty.
And every project ends up being very different.
Oh yeah, teams are different. Projects are different, flexing the products. I mean, like, look at the games that we've referenced so
Right.
far. Just a rainbow. I have to work them in.
Count how many times she says rainbow. All right, so the first thing I'm going to go over an example is fail fast, fail small. I'm going to cover the game I worked on, Outland Games, and then two other Yearwalk and Swapper. So when we did the Planetary Annihilation Kickstarter, we had this really base engine, or not many tools and not many features, so we decided to work on a small runner for iOS. When we started, there weren't a lot of runners, but there's like a glut of them as we started making it. But we're like, the first goal is to make sure we can get enough features into the game, get the engine running on iOS, and make it shippable for future titles. So on the top left or middle left screen is what the game looked like week one. It's a bunch of boxes. So the gray box to represent the character and a bunch of red boxes to represent our hazards. So we were getting our timing and getting the gameplay done using that prototype, simple prototype, while I was working on figuring out the look, the bottom left. The game we wanted to set in the Monday Night Combat world universe, and outside the main sort of arenas in Monday Night Combat, there's a place called the Outland, which is like a harsh Running Man type environment where there's a game show and a much smaller budget than Monday Night Combat in terms of like presentation. It's like off Vegas. So I wanted to convey the colors. So the colors are all warm and harsh. So we started with a warm palette, and then I wasn't really sure what the style was going to be yet, because we didn't really have a lot of features. We had just sprites. So the one to the right is a Photoshop mock-up a couple weeks later after we started. I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I, what is the perspective going to be? What's the character size in relation to the foreground? How is the background going to scale and parallax and things like that? So the 5 years I've been at Uber, a lot of our experience has been in 3D games. So trying to do a 2D game with a very base engine didn't seem like a great idea. And I'm a horrible animator, so I can sort of draw and illustrate and make models and do textures, but I wasn't going to do all the animation work. So we decided along the way to switch to a 3D approach. Even though the game was going to be a 2D side-scroll runner, we decided to just switch to 3D assets. So the screenshot on the left is a version of the world in progress using just the polygons for the silhouettes and textures mapped onto them. And the image on the right showcases how a level's put together. We have all these different pieces. Those are all 3D assets, just flat planes with textures mapped onto them. And what's also allowed us to use one of our animators who animate the character in 3D. So there's a screenshot from the shipped game. So the character is 3D, the foreground elements, everything is sort of flat polys, just faked. And the midground is all same polygons and things like that. And the background is just a matte painting. It's another screenshot. And switching to 3D also allowed us to reuse some of the assets we did for MNC. The characters in MNC1 were like 10,000 polys, so these were way less than that. We took them, optimized them, and scaled them, make sure they worked on a small screen. But we were able to reuse some of the animation work and just shift it a little bit to make it work for a side-scrolling game. So the next game I want to talk about is Yearwalk from Simogo. They started out as they want to do a puzzle game set in winter had a very mysterious, ominous tone. So they tried this style, which is sort of a top-down, simplified geometry with some textural base gradients on it. And as they were developing it and prototyping it, they tried to simplify it even more, still keeping the same kind of camera angle, but simplify the elements so they're flat trees and fake shadows and more texture. So the forms really read better in this version. So you get the nice tree silhouettes and you get the snow. And they're working further, and you see some concept work on the left. And in the bottom left, some other style tests with different color palettes, different shapes of the trees, kind of circular to angular. And then in the bottom right, almost more of a Mike Mignola, Hellboy kind of look with silhouetted background, very sparse colors, simplified palette. And they pushed that back in. They really wanted to make sure the snow read well. So on the top right is what they decided to go with. The game has a lot of depth. It's even though you go side to side, you can go in and out of the screen with a pinching and pulling back on the touch device. So they have a lot of 3D elements mixed with 2D elements mapped onto polygons, and they ended up coming up with this, which is the prototype of almost what the final game looked like. But it's still kind of it's hard to tell where to focus the eye. So when they added a post pass, you see they really use camera techniques well. Putting depth of field in the background, putting a slight vignetting on the edges so it kind of focuses attention in the midground. So that's what the game looks like, and it's fantastic if you haven't played it. It's called Year Walk. Swapper just came out, I think, a couple weeks ago. It's on Steam. Fantastic puzzle game. It's a side-scrolling puzzle game. You have this weapon called a Swapper gun. Kind of reminds me of Portal, a bit of Portal mixed with Braid, mixed with Metroid, and themed with the movie Moon, if you've seen that. So it's you're isolated character in a very moody environment. And what I really liked about this game, the gameplay is fantastic, by the way, but what I really liked visually is how rich and eerily realistic the textures and objects look. So I started doing some research and looking at the development of this game and found out it looks so real because the guy created everything from clay. It's fantastic. So Ollie, the creator of the game, prototyped the game with a simple art style, but he wasn't very good. He wasn't feel confident in doing 3D or illustration. He didn't think illustration style would really fit, so he wanted to see what he could do. So as a kid, he was his mom was a sculptor, so he learned how to sculpt with ceramics, and he learned how to animate with clay. So he's like, okay, I can do that. And just sort of like do what you know. So he create all the assets for the game with these clay models, photograph them, and use those photos to generate normal maps. And those normal maps are used to do lighting in 3D and the atmosphere and everything else. So the game is just fantastic, dripping with lots of atmosphere. And everything just has a great miniature handmade look because it is. So. Mm-hmm. So again, he just decided this is what I know. I'll do what I know, and it gave it a really unique look to the game.
All right, cool. So we're going to talk about art fundamentals and its application in games right here. So first one, composition. Composition is really important in terms of just kind of laying out your space, keeping in mind how the player will be interacting in your world is really crucial. Compose this space as you would as you keep in mind the gameplay goals. So you can really, if your game, you want it to be really spacey and awesome, doing that is great. But if they're you're limiting your character over here, it's not working. Color is a powerful tool. A well thought out color palette can evoke a certain kind of mood, foreshadow events, and draw the eye to key points in a game space. Contrast. The use of contrast can highlight elements you need the player to see or subdue the elements that they do not need to. Rhythm. Due to the interactive nature of games, it can definitely help to keep in mind how the eye will be drawn through a level. You can use strategically placed focal points as a tool to help guide a player to their next experience. Lighting kind of ties in with color and contrast, but it's a valuable tool in drawing the player's attention in addition to setting the mood and atmosphere. camera. Use determines how the player will see your game, and it can also help reinforce the project style and lend itself to setting the mood and or drawing out emotions. Motion or like animation of your game elements can set expectations in regards to how they will interact with your world and all that's in it. In addition, motion gives life to imagery. Just like any kind of art, there are many styles and many ways to execute it, so don't feel necessarily constrained like one way or another. But yeah, so those are the fundamentals, and we'll just go on to like some pretty rad, cool, awesome screens. So this is from Kentucky Route Zero, and they, I think, have an amazing grasp on composition and color, and this just, I just love this so much.
Why do you love it so much?
I love it so much because, you know, the space that the player is going to be in is highlighted, right? It's a lot more, it's brighter. You've got this really rad horse head in, like, on the right, on the left here. That big swooping line that goes through, the horse head kind of stops the eye from going off, which is kind of like, it composes it in a really nice way that, you know, you're just kind of focused in one area.
And you have the nice truck on the right side. This is the first establishing shot in the game. You come off that truck, and you're looking for directions. So just putting the truck on the right side and the horse on the left kind of terminates the composition, so it brings the attention back. And then the most sort of contrasty area is the lighting in the middle. And then you have there's nice angular swooping mountains in the background, kind of bringing the attention back down, sloping the attention back down the middle as well. Great stuff.
All right, and then this game Guacamelee, which is awesome on so many levels. The colors are just super rich. Like, look at that. It's like a rainbow. So, yep, I did it. So you see how they have like the grounding element there, right? The ground. And then you have all this verticality. So, you know, you can have your cool characters going around and like bouncing around doing all this like cool shit to each other. So that's a really smart way that the layout of like your game space actually helps with the gameplay. And I guess moving on to ridiculous fishing in terms of color. So Eka, you actually got to talk to this artist.
Right. So Greg, who
process.
worked on this game, he has a graphic design background. He also worked on hundreds, so you know, two different styled games. But his fundamental approach is he does everything and sort of, you know, approaches from a form perspective. So he does everything, lays everything on a grid, does it in Illustrator. He told me himself he is bad at color, but I call it complete bullshit because this is like a really good use of color. But he says, you know, he tries everything out in grayscale values just to make sure the forms read, which is the most important thing. It's really easy to mess up color, but if your values, your light and dark tones, and your shapes read really well. So he lays that out first, and then uses just color shifting to get the right values. I mean, that looks just a really inviting scene. That's from Ridiculous Fishing, which is a fantastic game, by the way, too.
Yeah, and just to just touch on that whole value process, I actually use this myself because I'm so visually oriented. And when I start playing with colors, I'm really attracted to shiny objects and fancy colors. So if I'm playing around with all these crazy colors and I'm not really focusing on the forms, it actually can kind of make my efficiency go down. So his process, I think, is something really valuable that you can take away from this in terms of working in grayscale and then building the color up. It's super easy to do. Yay, Photoshop.
What do you guys think about the diagonal pixels?
That's awesome. It's so he was working on his approach at this point was trying to try a different style because he just came off of hundreds with all circles. So that's where.
And there's a nice spin on that too, the whole 8-bitty kind of style.
Yeah,
it's
a very unique style. I haven't seen it. There's a software program called Hexels that came out around the same time. I asked if he used that, he didn't, because the Hexels is a program that lets you do this kind of look. Not exactly this, but kind of in a hexagon pixel art style.
Mm-hmm. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we've got a more muted color palette. But here, you're still using the colors to pop the elements that you want. Again, the vignetting, which is awesome. I think that's a really nice way to add some richness to a game space. And so you've got your main character right here. He's a little bit more red than the rest of the elements in the game. He's got like this, this face, and it's like super bright, and it's framed by this like cool dark hair. So I thought that was a pretty interesting use of color as well, just kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. And then, oh yes, all right, guess what I'm going to say again? All right, cool. So again, Guacamelee, right? Beautiful, beautiful colors in this. Like, I can't get over this. This is amazing stuff.
That's great in motion too. The animation style really fits the color style too.
And also here in this screen, I really like in particular is the fact that there is so much going on in terms of color and animation and characters and wow, crazy. But it's they've focused the players like where they're looking into the center, right? It's framed with those really dark elements of the ground and like the ceiling, right? So you are focused in the middle while there is like a lot of like crazy stuff going on. So that's a really useful fundamental to keep in mind. Just make sure that you're using art to kind of direct the gaze of the player, right? Like, what's going on in the game? Have it focus there. And then, ooh, yeah. So another slide from Kentucky Route Zero. Just amazing contrast. You've got like pretty much like black, right? With these beautiful complementary oranges and blues. I just think that this game looks gorgeous, and I just love it.
Yeah, good use of contrast, but composition, framing, just the values, everything. They do a good job.
So good.
Control camera in the game, so you can frame things really well.
And then we've got this interesting game called Incredipede, right? And so you see a lot of lines on there, and it is definitely like you could see how this could go really bad in terms of there's just a lot of noise visually, but they were really, really smart about this in terms of pushing the foreground elements, making them very crisp, making them more saturated, and then in the background, the elements are, they're blurred slightly, and they are also more pastel-y and less saturated. So they're really pushing the focus with the colors and the composition and the contrast.
The artist who worked on this was worked on traditional wood carving or woodworking. One thing also I want to mention in the contrast, so the foreground elements have a really thick, dark black outline, while the middle and background use a local color. So the outlines on the clouds are use a bluish local color, and then the green local color under the ground, which really helps separate the two elements.
And this game, so good. So Sword and Sorcery, you've got great use of rhythm here, and color, and contrast. So
And composition.
And composition, hey. So the elements that that the player needs to go to, are not only like echoing the rest of the environment, but it's also a lot darker. So like you want to go to like this cool like dungeon-y thing. What's in here? And there's like that little like arrowy icon thing at the top there.
When we talk about visual rhythm, we talk about repetitive patterns. So like for example, the style of the rocks or the repetitive elements in the foliage. Using those repetitive elements and the way it's laid out kind of focuses the eye into things that aren't repeating. For example, like the main character, the sheep. Not as many sheep, but and then the goal in this case is to go into that cave or temple.
And then another from Sword and Sorcery, and yay rainbow. But again, beautiful use of rhythm here again, and like just the contrast, right? I mean, look at how like faded out the background is, and how light it is, and how it pops the foreground, and it really like makes the player focus in the foreground. Like it's awesome. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and again, more rhythm with the sort of the circular shape of the rainbow that echoes the shape of the head there, the cave entrance. And you have sort of another circular shape on the top left corner with the trees, and then nice repeating patterns on the steps guiding your eye down to where the player needs to go. That's rhythm.
And Incredipede again. So, you know, you're moving to the
right. Yeah.
Okay, it's like, so you have the grass like kind of like hinting it that way, right? And you know, the wavy lines on top actually bringing it down, keeping your focus like towards the center, where the character is. Yeah, so there's that. Yes, and lighting. So you don't have to blow out your level with like bright lights for it to be interesting. I mean, like there are definitely games that have done that, but that's been like the art style. Here we've got on the opposite end of the spectrum, just the brilliant placement and pools of light and swapper. It's, I don't know, it's so good. Like it lends itself perfectly to like the gameplay, right? Like it's like this puzzly game that you're trying to like explore and figure things out in. So.
And all the main elements you need to interact with are highlighted well.
Right,
yeah.
exactly. So that again is, you know, art lending itself towards gameplay. And then this is probably my favorite shot from Swapper. Again, just, you know, the gentle pools of light. And then in regards to color too, I really like what they did with, there's like that really cool blue towards the top. And then as you go down, it gets a little bit warmer, which I think gives it a nice contrast so it doesn't just look washed out. Like, cool, I put blue over it. Like, it gives a little bit more richness, which this game has plenty of. And then Thomas was alone. So lighting in this game I thought was really smart because it echoes the rest of the style, right? These characters are blocking off light and they're casting shadows. They're very angular and geometric, just like the rest of the art style within the game. It just adds that extra level of atmosphere and depth to it, which is pretty cool. And Yearwalk, I mean, just this game is beautiful on so many levels. This too I'd also like to touch on is just kind of an example of keeping it simple, but also keeping, like, it's really rich. Like, having things simple doesn't necessarily mean that, like, there's less there or it's less enriching. Like, they are so smart and efficient with their art here that it really, you know, kind of bolsters the gameplay. And
Great framing too for camera.
so
yeah.
good. Alrighty, and then
I think this would be considered a murder rainbow.
we've got the Murder Rainbow. Welcome to Hotline Miami. So the use of camera here definitely plays to gameplay because you need to see like the line of sight of people and stuff like that. Also, another thing that I was noticing was there's a lot going on here, right? Having this be like maybe like a first-person shooter viewpoint would be a little overwhelming. Like, I'd probably curl up in a corner and cry if I played this game like that.
Well, and the gameplay would be different, right?
Oh, it'd be totally different, right?
You can see where the patrol paths are and like that, yeah.
Yeah, but this game, I mean, like, look at this color. It is awesome. And yeah, brilliant style. Awesome. Perfect. Moving on. Hundreds. So with this, the animation's a little bit, it's a lot more simple.
Yeah, and I mean the point of hundreds is you're presented with all these different screens, and you have to touch the circles. Every time you touch the circle, they grow in number. So it starts at 0, they'll go up, and you have to add up the circles to equal 100, and without the circles touching while you're doing it. So they're in constant motion, and as you touch them, there's a scale factor. So it's, you know, super simplified art style. Vignetting on the edges, focuses the score in the middle, and just great use of motion. And it varies from puzzle to puzzle. There's different elements they add, different speeds of things, different scale of things.
Cool.
All right.
Ooh, yeah. So Thomas Was Alone. The animation in this is awesome because they're just blocks, right? But they're so much more than this. The animation of the different blocks actually is kind of telling the player like who they are actually. So Thomas has got, you know, hella awesome jumping skills. He can jump really high. Whereas Claire is a little bit more mellow and she likes floating on things like in water.
But Thomas can't float, so
Nope.
he gets on top of Claire.
Yep. Teamwork.
All right, so a little bit about visual narrative. The top of the talk I mentioned a little bit about narrative. Is the art the art style, the art direction, the colors, anything? Is it supporting the gameplay? Is it helping the gameplay read better, communicate better to the player? And that's really the goal as an artist, as a visual. When you're focusing on the narrative, can you tell what's going on to the player, as just with an imaging, with imagery? And is it relatable? I mean, we make games for humans. I think, well, at least two of us do.
I'm a unicorn.
Or a unicorn. So there's some universal truth. Love, loss, farting, rainbows. Yeah. I mean, can people, can your player relate to what you're trying to get across? And you can do that visually with the right color, the atmosphere, the composition. Mm-hmm. So the first example I want to show is that does it well. I mean, this is the big intro to the game. Jack Lumber, tree killed his granny, now he's out for revenge. I mean, super simple narrative. What I loved is Granny's boots. I mean, he's got those lumberjack boots, and the tree is obviously evil because he's smiling before he falls on Granny. It doesn't have to be, the gameplay is like Fruit Ninja in a way, but it has a really great art style, has a little bit of narrative, sense of humor, which, that's all you need. You can communicate a lot with this same simple image. On the other side of the spectrum is Cart Life by Richard Hoffmeyer. It's the game lets you. He calls it a retail simulator. You play in the day of a role of several different street vendors. So in this case, there's this woman who has her daughter who just got recently divorced, and she has so much money. She's living at her sister's house, and then you have so many days to do a successful coffee shop. He calls it Georgetown, by the way. I'm sure he lives in Georgetown in Seattle. But doesn't mention city. So it's a heart-wrenching game. I mean, it's a really good empathy game. If you try it, I think it won a bunch of awards at GDC, this past GDC, for narrative design. But Richard does a great job with the visual style to communicate the pacing of the game. Like you have to try to run your coffee shop while your daughter's in school, and you can't be late to pick her up. She got to take the bus, and so he uses these different panels to kind of communicate how long things take and how difficult the tasks are. And what I really liked is at the end of every day, typically you finish a level, you have your stat screen, and this is what the stat screen looks like at the end of one day. But he ties it in by showing the character in the shower. Like he's reflecting on the things that happened that day while the player is looking at the stats. So it's a really good, relatable way visually to tie in stats, gameplay stats, on a human angle. And Thomas Was Alone. It's on PSN, Steam, all over the place. The basic premise of this game is a bunch of AI routines run amok. They generate personalities, and you start with the red rectangle, Thomas, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And as he's moving along and jumping, there's a narrator on top that talks about what he's thinking about, what Thomas is going through, why he's jumping, and how he's feeling. And then there's this nice little text block that follows him around too. So there's a nice, good visual audio tie-in. And then as you get farther, you end up controlling these different characters. So there's Claire, there's Thomas. I think that's Chris, the tall one. And they all have different abilities. I'm sorry?
It's John.
John, yes. Chris is a short one. John, so, as you meet each character, the narrator talks about what John's thinking and how he feels he's better than everybody else. And I showed this to my kids. I have two boys, 5 and 7, and the other day, they play like a lot of racing games and 360 and stuff, and I didn't know if they would like it, so I spent a couple minutes showing them. And immediately they started calling the characters, oh, get John over there first, get Chris over there first. It's not that block, it's Chris, it's John. It doesn't take much to just give it relate the characters to something that we can understand. And Thomas Was Alone does just a fantastic job. We mentioned about polishing your core experience, just touch on it again. It's how important it is, and Thomas Was Alone does a great job of, what is the player interacting with? It's a platformer, so, can he, what's the response time when you hit the button, and how does the character react? What happens when he dies? And, what happens when he lands at a long distance? What happens when he runs off a cliff? Those kind of things, how, if you can communicate with the animation work, or particles, or the lighting, or any color change. That goes a long way, and just enhance those with visuals. Let's see.
Cool. And just to recap, in regards to just kind of keeping your mind wide open, keeping in mind that, all teams are different, people are all different. So if you put them together, the teams are going to be different. It's scalable. And so your projects are going to vary. The starting point might not necessarily be your end point, and that can be okay. Being open to experimentation, but doing it at points in development that make sense. So when you're in pre-production, or like you're just starting to get your idea together, that's the time to experiment. Like that's the time to get all crazy, and then like rein it in, and then you can like go on with your pipeline. So that's that.
Yeah,
And
I
then-
just want to say that also, like all the projects I've ever worked on, you have an idea, have visual style, and you start with it, and ends up not being what what the resulting shipping version is way different than what you start with. So those kind of things you just have to let it happen naturally. Just start with a general idea, but don't lock yourself too tight with the game, with a game style, before you have the sort of gameplay worked out.
And then again, to recap, the game art toolbox. So fail fast, fail small, iterate, 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 iterate. And being smart about that. I mean, you don't want to be, iterating in circles. Like, you want to be making forward progress. Just something to keep in mind. Art fundamentals, like, you can hit us up if you want to know more about them, or you can...
We have lots of articles.
Yes, we got articles.
We can send you guys.
And Google also is useful, apparently. Keeping in mind your narrative and how you're reinforcing this visually through your game. Again, just kind of important aspect. Polishing your core experience and keeping an open mind. But in regards to visual narrative, I wanted to go back to that really quick. In terms of silhouettes and all that fancy jazz.
Yep.
So you're in a game, right? You're not going to be like this close to like every game element, unless that's your kind of game that you're making. So from afar, or like in the game view, it's kind of important to have readable silhouettes. I know that we were like covering games that like are kind of indie and have happened recently, but I wanted to go back to Team Fortress 2. Are you guys familiar with this game? Valve made it, and I might have heard of them. Anyways, so the archetypes that you're actually playing are just so well done, in my opinion, in terms of silhouette. The Scout's kind of long and lanky, and he's a little bit shorter than the rest too, right? And like that kind of like gives away his abilities. Like, he's fast and squirrely, and watch out for him. He's got a bat.
Also,
What the hell's going on?
You look shorter because the animation's like...
Yeah, he's like, he's down too. Whereas like, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got the heavy. He's like very big and bulky, and he's got he's a lot slower too, right? So that's something to keep in mind too, is silhouette. That's usually what I like start with whenever I'm doing concept. Just like making sure that like the silhouette is interesting and readable, and after all that, does it make sense for the goal that I'm trying to accomplish in terms of what I'm trying to concept. So I just wanted to throw that in there really quick.
And that's it.
Woo! Thanks, guys.
So if you have any questions for our game, yes?
What's the most visually distinctive or engaging game that you've played that the art carried it for you in the gameplay?
I'm sorry, and the gameplay,
Oh, just like a pretty game?
Yeah.
Just something pretty?
those aren't really memorable to me.
Yeah, exactly. I'm drawing a blank
It's
too.
usually like, I mean, we do art, but we do art for games. Like, we're not just making art, but in a vacuum. So, like the examples we picked were ones that really married the gameplay with the art amazingly well. And typically, games that just have a visual, really nice visuals and no gameplay, I don't think do well.
Yeah.
In the long run, like you kind of lose interest because once you get into a game, you stop seeing the visuals and you kind of you get more immersed into the gameplay. So like the visuals are important because it's the first thing your audience sees. It's the first screenshot, it's the first trailer, but there has to be some content to keep you interested. So.
It's got to have soul. Anything else?
Anybody else? Yes.
Color palette.
Yeah.
Mine madness, the extremes, do you guys find like there's after so many colors, you sort of 8 colors, 10 colors, 200? Like at what point do you say your color palette's complete and work within that versus?
When it does the job, probably. Like
Yeah.
whatever, like if your goal is to be like, I want to do like a minimally colored game, like just picking your colors smart as opposed like to just like you have like a photorealistic game that you're working on.
Yeah, and depending on the levels, like sometimes we'll do mood boards. So at the beginning of, if it's, let's say it's a linear game like Lord of the Rings, for example, in game format, there's an arc, right? There's like, they start, where they start, where they end. Like the look of those spaces, environments are very different. So they'll kind of define a color palette to reflect the gameplay and mood. So it'll vary. Like something like Ridiculous Fishing, there's a different mood underwater than there is above water and in the sky when you're blowing up fish once you reel them in. And then there's a different sort of mood, a slightly different mood in the menu and everything. So there's, you're trying to communicate what the player is doing, and if you can do subtle color shifts like that, kind of help them communicate where they are, it helps a lot. So. Yes.
Not to coerce you into bad-mouthing anyone specifically,
Yeah.
but I would love to hear your feelings on, especially smaller fry projects, sort of the art direction failures you've seen that you feel like are easily rectifiable. I've got a friend who hates Awesome Knots art design for some.
I love Awesome Knots.
Yeah, I agree too, but for her, it's got that sort of Facebook look to her, and I don't know if that's
Facebook. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
But as far as things that you notice there that are just easily rectifiable when someone's totally off the path, because it's easy to say these are good.
Sure. I mean, we did have a slide we took out in there, which was like visual trends. I mean, it's really good to know about what's going on. I mean, if you look in the iOS store, look at the Minecraft, art style clones. There's just a ton of them. Or Limbo was a just great game on XBLA in 2010, and those kind of, I see a lot of those kind of like super stark, contrasty mood of type games coming out too. I think it really varies depending on the game. Some people, if they think it looks like a Facebook game, that's a bad connotation. That's what are you gonna do about that?
Yeah, people also have different like tastes too.
Yeah.
Like people have different preferences.
Yes.
So I know that like user interaction design is a big field, at least like for research. So at what point do you think it's worthwhile to almost like play test the artwork, like put it in front of people and ask them like questions about it and see how like intuitive it is?
Yeah, we've done that. So the problem with I've done a couple ways. I've done just concept work. It's like, hey, what do you think about this? Like, does it look like a Facebook game? Or tell me what comes to mind, right? So there's that. That's just separate, like just the art isolated. Then we've also done it where it's in the gameplay, so you play it, see it in the context with the gameplay. So depending on where you are and how polished the gameplay, you might have different feedback. So you kind of have to kind of go with. I mean, art style is a very personal thing. Like what you bring to the table. Like Swapper, Ollie brought his clay, right? And that's what makes it interesting. Is he brought his personal style because he felt like that's what fit the game. So I think you can do some feedback testing, which we've done for gameplay. We do Kleenex testing all the time. We bring people in, sit them down, and watch them mess up our game while we rip our hair out. That's all good feedback, but that's you shouldn't really use that to inform the direction you want to go. It's really just like say maybe we need to shift this or shift that. I mean, you really have to drive it yourself. I think I personally feel. So.
I had a question up there.
Yes, up there.
So can you think of any cases where the art direction was good, it was well implemented, it had all the things you liked, and the gameplay was also good, but the two of them were in conflict. They were fighting. The art wasn't reinforcing the gameplay. Are there any examples you could point to?
I don't.
Does anybody else have an idea on that?
Yeah, does anyone else?
Maybe it's like you said, you just don't remember those games.
Exactly.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, we wanted to keep it positive.
Yeah. Yay!
Rainbows.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
I was going to mention that I found that like games that go for like an extremely realistic kind of look and then a very minimalistic gameplay kind of often like were just unsettling. It wasn't always bad, but sometimes it can be a little bit weird.
Yeah. People like to badmouth Gears of War because they're like, oh, it's just a bunch of dudes, Space Marines. But it's got a terrific art style. It really fit. I mean, their whole idea of sort of like beauty chaos, like all these really interesting spaces all blown up, and I thought it did a really good job. And even Modern Warfare, I mean, there's some really great. I mean, that's a super popular game. Everyone loves it. Most people love it. But it's, there's some great moments in those games that, like when that nuke goes off and you're in the middle of that. There's some awesome visual moments. They do a good job. Yes, Ed?
I'm curious, kind of back to your trends thing,
Yeah.
sort of this trend to retro, which is fun. But sometimes it can be beautiful, like the Sword of Sorcery.
Yeah, yeah,
Sometimes it can just be ugly.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know. My
Some-
kids are really into Terraria right now.
Yes.
It's a very fun game.
Yes.
I just find it visually, just personally.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know. It's almost like ugly is unique now. Because it's like something we haven't had. So
Well,
I'm
yeah.
just curious.
Yeah, I mean, Terraria, I think it does a great job of getting what it's trying to get across, which is the building gameplay and kind of, my initial reaction was like, hey, 2D Minecraft. That's what I thought of, because Minecraft was there, and that's, they're sort of like, whatever's the big thing out there, that's what's going to be in people's on their mind. So everything's going to get compared to Minecraft, or things are going to get compared to Limbo, or because those were or TF2. Like when we did Monday Night Combat, we got compared to TF2 because we're stylized and it's a shooter, right? So it's whatever the biggest player out there, you will, the mind share will be kind of associated with that. I don't know if I would know Terraria is okay, but it's not really compelling. But I think his service is obviously it's doing well, right? So,
Yeah.
what do I know? But
I guess maybe a way to put the question is, does it bother you guys as artists,
Yeah.
to see successful things that maybe aren't beautiful?
If I was worried about that, like, my life would be terrible. Like, I just worry about, like, what I need to do and, the job at hand. Like, just worry about your own shit. Like, keep your negativity. No.
I'm really excited. I mean, games right now, there's tons of really interesting indie games, and just with, iOS proliferation and mobile and Unity, like some of these games were all made in Unity, and just how accessible it is. So I've seen a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, just riffing off that too, like the indie game space, like we're doing cool shit. Like we're doing some really unique stuff, and like I just encourage everyone, keep making games, please. Keep making cool art, please, so I can be like, yay! Boop, 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 boop.
Yes, I'm back.
You specifically pointed out that, TF2 and Super Monday Night Combat had some similarities.
Yeah.
You guys probably thought about that going in. Did you do anything specific to kind of counteract that?
We actually went the other way, because we did a crossover with TF2 where we played off that.
Okay.
So we had our characters that we switched hats and did all sorts of things. So Valve was really good about it. So we're like, that's what people think, fine, but the gameplay's completely different, so we'll just play off of that. It's just sort of the art I liked, and I wanted to go in that direction. And it really fit the nature of the world. We wanted kind of this tongue-in-cheek, over-commercialized future and bacon. And so trying to go more realistic in character wouldn't have worked. And real big personalities like big MVP sports athletes. It just made sense to go more stylized with it. Yes.
Yeah. So in indie games, I see it's very common for pixel art to be used very liberally, and obviously there are some advantages in sort of scope. It's maybe a little easier to get something quickly.
Yeah, production time depending on the style could be a factor.
From a visual standpoint, I often feel like it's offering nostalgia. It sort of relies on nostalgia. Do you think that there is like a clear visual advantage, or is there something that is accomplished besides nostalgia and pixel art, or is that kind of the primary?
It's a style, right?
Yeah, I mean, have you played Hotline Miami?
I've not been on that.
I don't know if I think it looks retro, but like the way they did their version of pixel art really stands out because of sort of like these, things you couldn't do back in the. Actually, a lot of these retro games that look like 8-bit games. If you look back at the real 8-bit games, you can't do that many frames and that many pixels and or that many colors. Yeah, I mean it does. There's the nostalgia involved, but some of the games I think like Sword and Sorcery I think did just a fantastic.
Oh, so good.
Yeah, mixture of sort of modern
Sorry.
techniques and with sort of more pixel techniques, but I think it varies.
It's not nostalgia if the bulk of the people buying the game weren't alive when that
Yeah.
title.
Yep, there you go. That's a good point.
Yes.
So, as visual designers, how do you feel we're going to have to change what we do in regards to the Oculus Rift?
Oh, we have one at the office. It's really cool. I get sick after like 30 minutes, but
Are there any visual patterns that you're seeing or differently because of it?
I don't know. I haven't played around with it enough. We've been so busy with our projects. I checked out, played TF2, and it was really hard to play with it. There's a space game I can't remember someone was making. It was probably the best example because it had the HUD built into the console. It's a first-person space sim, and that worked really well. Any of the games I tried with the UI sort of in the UI space was really disorienting because your focus keeps changing, from focusing on the UI element to what's out in the world. The resolution is still, it's the dev kits are 1280, 720, so I think they're going to double it for the release.
Well, they're split in half, too.
Yeah, so it's not really even using the full resolution. I don't know. I mean, I haven't done any games in that space, so.
Good.
Yes, time.
Thanks, guys.
Yay!
Thank you.